What's going on, everybody? It's Q from Retro Q Gaming, and of course, I'm here today with a special video for you guys. Now, over all these years, many people throughout comments, tweets, live streams, videos, whatever it is, have always asked me, Q, what's going on? What's your favorite game of all time? What are your top 3 games, your top 5 games, your top 10 games? And I've always kind of just put it off and shrugged it off to an extent. I've always given them little bits of the list and whatnot too. I've always said it's extremely difficult for me to narrow down what my top 10 games of all time are in, well, what's 30 odd years of gaming at this point across so many different generations, so many different iterations of hardware, consoles, handhelds, PC, whatever it is. But I'm here today to actually finally pull the trigger and make that video. Now, this video is in no particular order, but I will say I am saving my number 1 game of all time until the very end. Now, you might be wondering why it's in no particular order. Well, I'm going to pull that whole non-committal card because realistically, this list, games number 2 to 10, are all just so extremely high quality to me. They mean so much in so many different ways, and I've loved and enjoyed them so much over so many different periods of time, hardware platforms, whatever it was, that I just literally cannot put a direct number, a direct order on these. So you can kind of take it as there's obviously a number 1 game, but you can take the rest as number 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 are all equal in that regard. Some of them you may know, some of them you may know I love, some of them you may not know, some of them you may not know I love. But realistically, these are my top 10 games of all time. Remember, no particular order except the last one, which is going to be number 1. Oh, and yes, you're not imagining things. I didn't miscount, but 2 of these spots are shared by 2 games each. Chrono Trigger, one of the most famous games of all time. One of the top tier, top quality Super Nintendo JRPGs of all time. Made by Squaresoft back in their golden era heyday, it still remains one of the most well regarded and most loved RPGs of all time 24 years later after release in 2019. There's so much to love about Chrono Trigger, especially because of how landmark and groundbreaking it was at the time. The smooth and slick transitions, from the field map to battle and right back again, to the music, the art, the story, the setting, the layout, everything about it is loved by so many people, and it's done so well, especially when you consider the hardware and the technology of the time. So many different side quests, so many different optional stuff, some of which required going back and forward in time, doing stuff in the past that influenced the future, and multiple branching different endings. Chrono Trigger remains one of those games that will live on forever. And speaking of living forever, the quality of this game speaks for itself, not just in the visuals, the music, but the gameplay 100% holds up. And the perfect examples for this are people playing it for the first time, even now in 2019, they still love it, despite being born maybe years later, or never growing up in the Super Nintendo era. The quality of the gameplay and the mechanics, and the story, and everything involved speaks for itself. I feel like that comes into play ever so slightly as well with my personal experience from Chrono Trigger, because here, back in the day in Europe, we didn't get Chrono Trigger on the SNES. While it released in Japan and in the US in 1995, Europe didn't get its own first proper release of Chrono Trigger until the DS in 2009. So I had never properly got to play Chrono Trigger until around the year 2000, maybe 2001, when I imported a Super Nintendo from the US and a copy of Chrono Trigger. So despite having no nostalgia for the game at the time, it still stood strong as a masterpiece of JRPGs. And it did kind of help one thing, it kind of helped soothe over the fact that way back in the day, the official Nintendo magazine even had a massive Chrono Trigger themed issue where it was a giant, full page, full front cover of Chrono Trigger. Had a maybe 8 to 10 page giant spread all over everywhere, all about Chrono Trigger. And even in the middle had a fold out 4-page poster of the gorgeous pixel art of the Millennium Fair. And of course, naturally, we never got the game. But luckily, it's now widely available for everyone to play. These next 2 games, while in the same series but both very, very different, I just have to make them occupy the same spot. Persona 4, or more specifically, Persona 4 Golden, because that's the one I properly and I truly experienced, and that's the one that made me fall in love with the series properly. Now, while Persona 4 Golden wasn't my first exact foray into the series, Persona 3, or rather Persona 3 Portable, had got me interested in them several years prior. But I wanted to play Persona 4 Golden so much ever since I had seen way back in the day when they had a PS2 copy of regular Persona 4 in my local GameStop. At its time of release, it was brand new and cost more than brand new Xbox 360 games. So naturally, it was a bit of a hard sell. Of course, I passed on it for those reasons, and then eventually, years later, I would buy a PlayStation Vita just to play Persona 4 Golden. And boy oh boy am I thankful I did. When I played Persona 4 Golden, I fell absolutely in love with that game. I was head over heels with it in so many different ways. I love the Persona games, the Persona series, so much. It does things that other JRPGs that I know and love, like say Final Fantasy for example, just don't do. And it does that by keeping it small, keeping it tight, and keeping it focused. Instead of being worried about saving the entire world or something to those effect, we're looking at a much smaller scale, maybe a town or a city, and certain mystical problems therein. Of course, the Persona series is famous at this point for its quality of music, as well as its quality of gameplay, but where it really excels is its investment, its emotional investment, and how it handles character bonding to really invest you and connect you to the characters, the people, the story, the location, everything about it. That's something that's pretty much not replicated in any other games or any other series. And it will absolutely always be one of the highest quality selling points of the Persona series. And as a quick extra aside for just how great Persona 4 Golden is, it was the first game that ever made me make an emotional choice over a logical choice as I would usually do. Without going into detail because massive plot spoilers would be involved, you are given a choice at some point in the game. You can make one choice, which might give you a little bit of satisfaction and will give you an unfortunate, worse ending. Or you can pick the morally good option, and then you can go on and get the good ending, essentially. But based on everything that had happened, and all the bonds and everything involved in the story, and my time with them at that point, no. I needed my personal version of justice, and I chose the bad one. And that is probably the first time I've ever done that. In fact, to this day, it's probably one of the maybe 3 or 4 different times I've ever done that. And that was the first game ever to make me make a choice like that. That will speak volumes with just how strong the characters, the story, the mechanics, everything they do, and how it affects you. Persona 5, another game that I would definitely, absolutely 100% consider a modern masterpiece. When you look at some of the other games in this list that are considered older, more retro, nostalgic games, that are generally considered to be some of the best games of all time by not just myself, but of many other people and many other outlets. I make absolutely no hesitation whatsoever to say that when I played Persona 5 and I got a little bit into it and I started getting involved with it, it instantly jumped into that upper echelon, the top tier of highest quality games. And of course, that leads on from my experience with Persona 4 Golden. With just how amazing and fantastic that game was, I was curious, no matter how you looked at it, just to see how great, how fantastic, what they could do next with the next Persona game. And thankfully, they delivered in spades. Persona 5 is basically everything Persona 4 did, and more, and better. The social link system is expanded and improved. The world, the characters, the style, hell, even the UI, everything oozes charm and character and vibe, as is evidenced by the music. And of course, it has that amazing, top-tier, turn-based battle system. It's no wonder that this game is such well-received and so highly regarded, especially among JRPG fans, but not just those. In fact, it's so well regarded because it's such a great game that even non-traditional JRPG fans are exploring this game. And it's doing so well that Persona 5 alone accounts for over a quarter of the biggest milestone of the Persona series, that it just recently hit with 10 million sales across the entire series. Over a quarter of them are Persona 5 alone. And this leaves me with two more questions. One, with the upcoming Persona 5 Royal. They seem to be putting a large additional amount of content in there. I wonder how that's going to go. Is it going to be so high quality as I expect? Is it going to add so much more depth to the game? And two, how are they going to top all of this with Persona 6 in several years when that comes out? If it's anything like moving from Persona 3 to Persona 4 and then Persona 4 to Persona 5, Persona 6 could be the greatest game of all time. But speaking of time, only time will tell. Silent Hill 2. A game many rightfully consider a psychological masterpiece. Often compared to the Resident Evil series, I really disagree with that comparison. I consider one of them to be a survival horror, the other one to be a psychological horror. And while Silent Hill 1 was great in so many ways, Silent Hill 2 really nailed absolutely everything it needed to do. The atmosphere in these games is absolutely insanely great. It fits absolutely perfectly. The camera work, the music, the sound effects, the psychological horror aspects, as well as how everything, without giving away any spoilers, factors in from the story, and pretty much everything in the world has a proper true meaning and purpose. Coupled with the general fear and psychological aspects that they throw at you in pretty much all the Silent Hill games, Silent Hill 2 is the pinnacle of psychological horror games across any generation whatsoever. And with multiple different endings and multiple different unlocks, there's plenty of replayability outside the overall sheer quality of the game. Just like every other game in this list, it is absolutely something I highly recommend because it just completely nails what it wants to be absolutely perfectly. Pretty much everything it wants to convey, it does in absolute minute detail. It is probably the complete perfect representation of a psychological horror game and how it should be done versus how it could be done. An absolute masterpiece. The Legend of Zelda: Link to the Past. Heralded by many, correctly if you ask me, as the greatest Zelda game of all time, Link to the Past did so many amazing things that were just not possible previously in the series because of hardware limitations, or maybe just because of creative ideas at the time. Not to mention the amazing music and some of the visual effects as well. That rain at the start comes to mind. Overall, a gorgeous game in pretty much every regard. Very well done, very well controlled, and it plays exceptional. Despite being a relatively small world compared to some of the other games at the time, or some of the games on this list even, they still managed to flip it on its head with the whole light world, dark world. And because of that, it created essentially two new, very different, but still kind of familiar places to play in. And naturally, they could be very, very different in the best of ways. And of course, what Zelda game would be complete without massive amounts of hidden extras, stories and side content in there too. The little bit of puzzle solving just dashed over everywhere, ever so slightly now and again. It really keeps the pacing of the game just where it should be. It never feels too fast, too rushed, or too slow, and just at the right times, it gives you something to spice it up, or maybe give you a little bit of a lull, just so you can go exploring that new area, or go back to some of your older ones with your new gadget. Something that is unfortunately lost with inferior games in the series, like Breath of the Wild. Final Fantasy VI, or Final Fantasy III for you American viewers out there. Given how they only released certain games and changed the numbers of them originally outside of Japan, but to me it will always still be Final Fantasy VI. Not just because it's officially Final Fantasy VI, but my first proper experience with it was as Final Fantasy VI. Because here in Europe, back in the day, in the Super Nintendo days, we didn't get Final Fantasy VI. We didn't even get it as Final Fantasy III. Our first experience and our first release with it over here was on the PlayStation 1, the very tail end of the PlayStation 1, as Final Fantasy VI. Back when they were releasing Final Fantasy 1, 2, 4, 5 and 6 to get everyone caught up on it. In fact, Final Fantasy VI was so late in the generation, over here at least, it even came with a playable demo of Final Fantasy X on PlayStation 2. But none of that took away from the absolute astounding quality of one of the golden age 16-bit era Squaresoft JRPGs, a game that still stands so tall, so loved, and so well regarded to this day. When you look at the game, the music, the setting, the characters, the systems, the mechanics, everything involved, including the technological limitations, which still managed to push out some of the highest quality music that everyone knows and loves, as well as an absolutely huge and amazing story with an absolute bevy and wealth of huge additional side content, side characters, and so many additional extras. It's no wonder that Final Fantasy VI makes it onto this list. And on a personal note, when coming to Final Fantasy games and what was in my top 10 of all time, well, I usually had to kind of condense it down a little. And some spots would typically have 2 games in them. One of these spots was previously Final Fantasy IV and Final Fantasy VI. Both fantastic games, but naturally, there's always that little hint of nostalgia, that little pang. Not exactly from when it was originally launched, because like I said, we didn't get the 2 games here originally, we didn't get either of them. Maybe it was just the fact that I hadn't played them in so long. So much so that when I went back to play them earlier this year and late last year, I still managed to make it through Final Fantasy VI, played that whole thing, loved it, enjoyed it as the masterpiece that it is, but Final Fantasy IV is a little bit more rough around the edges. It didn't hold up as well, it's still a decent game, but I could never really truly decide which Final Fantasy I loved more, 4 or 6. Now, it's definitely 6. And that's why 6 makes this list. Whereas previously, it was 4 and 6 sharing the same space. Now, it's just 6. Shenmue, or rather, Shenmue 1 and 2, because yes, these ones are getting the same shared spot. I feel like this one is a little bit warranted. But anyway, Shenmue, 2 games that defined the Sega Dreamcast, Sega's unfortunate last console, but they went out with a bang given the quality of these games. Pioneered by Yu Suzuki, Shenmue 1 and eventually Shenmue 2 basically became a genre-creating, genre-defining game, or series of games. What was essentially the first proper, real, true open-world game that we know and love as of today. Of course, there was ones beforehand, but nowhere near the depth or the breadth of what you'd have and the detail, the individuality, everything in Shenmue. To the point where it feels like that every game on the PlayStation 2, the GameCube, the Xbox, and even beyond felt like they were trying to emulate what Shenmue managed to achieve. Couple all of that with great gameplay, a fantastic story, and for, at the time, great visuals, not to mention the voice acting. The tale of Ryo Hazuki has gone on to become legendary. Fans of Asian martial arts revenge cinema would be right at home with confusing this for something that they love. I will absolutely always maintain that these games, in so many different ways, are absolute masterpieces. Especially the very last part of Shenmue 2. With no spoilers, I feel like one of the narrative mechanics used exclusively in that part of the game is just absolutely amazing. It fits completely in with the game and everything you've done beforehand, and it really gets you suited in and paired up with Ryo Hazuki. The original game at the time was so impressive, and the story so captivating and moving, that they even essentially made a film version that aired in Japanese cinemas. Took out about an hour and a half or so of key major cutscenes and story points and put them all together to tell the story. This of course is called Shenmue the Movie and was included with the original Xbox release of Shenmue 2, as the first game was not available on the console, so it would fill in the gaps of the story for everyone. Of course, here in Europe we got Shenmue 1 and 2 on the Dreamcast, so it was kind of a moot point, here at least. But it was nice to have for anyone who would come in on the Xbox platform as their first one to the series. And just as a minor little aside, Shenmue is how I met one of my oldest friends to this day. And even every now and again, we still joke and look back with fond memories just about how we met because of Shenmue. Pokemon Gold. Now, that's right, yes, I'm using Gen 2, Pokemon Gold in my case. Obviously, it could also apply to Silver, but I grew up playing Pokemon Gold for my version of Gen 2. Now, many people will probably consider it blasphemy that I'm not using Gen 1, Pokemon Red all the way, by the way, as the game that goes in and fits on my top 10 spot of greatest games of all time. But there's a reason for that. as absolutely phenomenally landmark, whatever adjective you want to use for Pokemon Gen 1, as great as it was, as much time as I spent in it, in fact I probably spent more time in Gen 1 than I did in Gen 2, I still consider Gen 2 Gold a slightly better game. It added so much more, it did so much more, it has a very, very important key feature that, to the best of my knowledge anyway, hasn't properly been replicated to this day in any new Pokemon game. But with all the small extra additions that weren't huge and landmark, like the one I'm going to praise now in a moment, it felt like it added the most, the more extra, if you will. Not just the small quality of life things, but it added those little bit extra steps. It took a few more steps as an increment that everyone else did. When you look at the differences between Gen 2 and 3, 3 and 4, 5 and 6, it felt like the big difference was between 1 and 2. That felt like the biggest, largest improvement. And don't get me wrong, of course I've loved so many different generations of Pokemon at this point. And most of them are great in their own regard, except for maybe Sun and Moon. I absolutely hated those ones. But no, Gen 2, Pokemon Gold, that was where it's at for me. Two of the biggest vast improvements that they put in between Gen 1 and Gen 2 was the advent of the clock/night and day cycle. This was something that was not present in Pokemon Gen 1. So in Gen 2 you had your morning, you had your evening, and you had your nighttime. Different things could happen, different Pokemon could spawn, there was all sorts of things that could go on because of that clock system that was added in Gen 2. And of course, the huge big one that I praise more than anything as the biggest improvement ever in a single Pokemon game is that Pokemon Gen 2, once you completed the new Johto region, you could go back to Gen 1, you could go back to Kanto. You could take on their 8 series of gyms. You could do all of that. It was essentially revisiting the old one, getting what I believe is pretty much almost every single original Pokemon in that region too. And as far as I know, to the best of my ability and knowledge anyway, that system to go back to a prior region hasn't been included in any other Pokemon game since. Any mainline one anyway. And those are some of the bigger, more important features that I consider Gen 2 to be the best. There was other ones as well that they've improved upon ever so slightly nowadays. For example, Gen 2 also brought in the advent of the phone system. Nowadays that's done in so many different watches and apps and whatever on the 3DS or whatever system you're playing on and whatever Pokemon game you're playing on. And of course now it not only features trainers that you've already fought and battled with in-game, but now it's extended to other players online as well. But it really added some more extra depth and a little bit more replayability into the game. And while we all love stuff like the Rotodex, the GTS, the mystery based system, or whatever there is in all different generations of Pokemon, I still feel that Pokemon Gold is where it's at, and it deserves the spot more than any other mainline Pokemon game on my top 10. Secret of Mana 2, or as it's also known by in its native land of Japan that it never originally released outside of, Seiken Densetsu 3. Or more commonly known, more recently anyway, as Trials of Mana. For the purposes of this, I'm going to call it Secret of Mana 2 because that's what I've known it as for all these years. But Secret of Mana 2 is a real top quality, high-end experience of a game. Released towards the end of the generation on the Super Nintendo exclusively in Japan, they took a lot of what made Secret of Mana so great, and with all the improvements in technology and systems over the time, they implemented many of them into Secret of Mana 2. In fact, let me give you a great example. The original Secret of Mana was being developed and built around the upcoming, at the time at least anyway, Super Nintendo CD system that would allow for vast improvements in storage capacity, including higher quality CD level music, as well as much bigger game worlds, up to 40 times larger, depending on what cartridge size they were using originally. But when that system fell through, the CD system, many of the original mechanics and features had to be removed from Secret of Mana, to the point where the game was almost cancelled. Thankfully it wasn't, but a lot of them were ported into various iterations of other games. Final Fantasy VI, Chrono Trigger, and Secret of Mana 2 are notable examples of this. So they took what they learned in the original development and implemented it into some of these new games. The day and night cycle is a perfect example of this. Originally planned to be in Secret of Mana, but had to be removed, luckily was implemented in Secret of Mana 2, and it worked out amazingly. You've got different enemies, different enemy behaviors, a day of the week system, all different types of bonuses and benefits depending on your perfect situation. And that's not even mentioning the quality of the gameplay, the combat, the visuals, which are some of the highest quality on the Super Nintendo, and of course the 3-disc CD music soundtrack. And it really goes to show just how big the game is. They had so much music that it fit on 3 different CDs, as well as there being 6 main characters. And those 6 characters broke down into 3 different main stories. Essentially, 2 main characters would share the vast majority of one plot point, with 1 or 2 minor deviations based on their own personal lore and backstory, but it still gave for a nice variety. You might pick character A, and then you might be fighting people that you would only associate with usually in maybe character D's story. Someone that would have been an ally in one story is an enemy in another. And that allows so many different branching stories. Coupled with the sense of exploration and the world design, it's no wonder this is considered a true treasure when it comes to old school Super Nintendo high quality JRPGs. Many people, myself included, are originally only familiar with this game from its ROM translated fan hack. Since it was only released in Japan originally, naturally fans had to translate the ROMs and release them to everyone else. So for years and years and years, I was stuck playing one of those, until I eventually got an English fan-translated ROM reproduction card. Works on my Super Nintendo, works on my analog Super NT. Until eventually, Square Enix released the Collection of Mana, at first only exclusively on the Japanese Switch, where you had Suikoden Densetsu 1, Secret of Mana, and Secret of Mana 2, of course, all in their original Japanese forms. And then, earlier this year, a surprise announcement happened during Nintendo's E3 presentation where they released and announced the Collection of Mana in English, releasing what is now called Trials of Mana in English for the first time over 20 years later. And couple that with an upcoming 3D full remake next year, one that does look fairly promising, unlike the unfortunate 3D remake of Secret of Mana. It's been a great period of time to love and appreciate this game, as well as for many new people to finally be exposed to it as well. Final Fantasy VII. Naturally, this game was going to make the list. While not my favourite Final Fantasy game, that honour gets reserved for Final Fantasy VI, it would be absolutely remiss of me to not mention how monumental and influential, and just overall how much of a great game Final Fantasy VII is. It did so much in many different regards. We had already previously established the amazing music from Final Fantasy as a series on cartridges, and now we had CD quality music in there too. Coupled with what were at the time next-gen visuals of the PlayStation 1, Final Fantasy VII represented a huge step forward for JRPGs, both into the 3D world, if you will, the next-gen, as well as so much in storytelling, characters, side content, everything you can think of. Final Fantasy VII did it bigger, better, and more explosively. To the point where the game was so big and so expansive, it had to span 3 separate CDs. Which of course was one of the big, important decisions at the time to move away from their long-term business partner, Nintendo, and jump onto Sony with the PlayStation and what they could do with the hardware of that platform that was not offered to them with the likes of the Nintendo 64. But naturally, everyone knows Final Fantasy VII. It's a phenomenon at this point. People can say what they want about the game, but the fact is, it basically changed JRPGs for the rest of the world. And as a European, it introduced us to Final Fantasy as a series. We had never got a mainline entry Final Fantasy game here in Europe beforehand. All we had ever got was one of the Game Boy games, and Final Fantasy Mystic Quest, a game that, because the name and the branding had no appeal and no marketability here in Europe, was actually changed away from Final Fantasy Mystic Quest to Mystic Quest Legend, removing all reference to Final Fantasy. But thankfully, Final Fantasy VII, its battle system, its music, its visuals, its characters, its world, its mechanics, its extras, have created hundreds, if not thousands of hours for everyone over all these years. Not just to the point where it's got slight upgrades and slight remasters, but it's become one of, if not the biggest and most loved and most known and respected Squaresoft title, to the point where we are finally getting a full 3D from the ground up entire remake of the game. Everyone's been calling for it for 22 years at this point. We finally have it coming. That within itself should probably speak volumes of how well regarded and much loved this game actually is. Well, you know what they say about saving the best for last. So we have Secret of Mana, my #1 favorite game of all time. Such an amazing top tier experience. I absolutely love this game with every fiber of my being. Everything about it, from the gorgeous colourful visuals, to the story, the mechanics, the gameplay, the amazing music, and even the fact that it had not only 2 but 3-player local co-op. Travelling around the land, wielding 8 different types of weapons and all different types of magical elements, across a gorgeous and varied world. Secret of Mana is that one special something in my case. I still remember the very first day and the very first time I played it, and I've been in love with it ever since. Thankfully it's been ported to multiple different platforms, as well as suffered a couple of less than stellar remakes and remasters, but it's still easily available, including the Wii Virtual Console, the Japanese Wii U Virtual Console, some unfortunate iOS and Android ports, a pretty awful 3D remake on the PS4 and PC, and more recently included in its proper original form in the Collection of Mana on the Switch. Thankfully, there are no shortages of playing this game wherever it is for anyone. I highly encourage everyone to do so, and maybe you can see just why I love this game so much. In fact, as of today, this morning, I just got all the additional cabling I needed to use my newly acquired Sony PVM, and of course it looks great, and the very first thing I'm going to do properly on it is do another proper, gorgeous, amazingly slick and smooth playthrough of Secret of Mana in its best possible way. But that's it, everyone. That is the end of the video. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope it's given you a little bit of an insight into me, my selection of games, my tastes, as eclectic as they are, what I love about games, gaming, and why in general. Now, of course, it's not to say that there's not many other games out there that I still absolutely love and adore in so many different ways that just do not make this top 10 list. Vandal Hearts, Legend of Dragoon, Final Fantasy IV, Shadow Hearts Covenant, Star Ocean, Persona 3, Breath of Fire 4. The list is almost endless with how many amazingly high quality games are out there that I absolutely love and adore, but unfortunately do not make this list. Anyway, let me know in the comment section below what you thought of my top 10 games of all time. Do you agree with some of them? Do you disagree with some of them? And of course, more importantly, what are some of your top, maybe 1, top 3, top 5, or even top 10 games of all time? Let me know all of that good stuff in the comment section below. Maybe even include a little story when it comes to your favorite game of all time. And then hit the appropriate button to let me know how I did on the video, and while you're at it, why not head on over and hit the subscribe button and even ring the little notification bell. Granted, getting a notification from YouTube in current year about a new video upload or live stream or whatever is a whole other story, but hey, at least you can say you tried, am I right? As always, thank you so much for watching, and I will see you in the rest of the videos in my channel.